Please make sure cell phones are off or on vibrate.
Folks, we got a very cramped courtroom. Apparently, there may be a family of the victim here, so I may ask them to take that second row, that second pew there. I'll let you stay there because I know you're a camera guy. So, are they coming this morning or no? They're not. Okay, so then you can stay there. All right, go ahead and turn the camera on. Okay, welcome back into the session. Are we ready for the jury? That's the jury, right?
Please, ready,
Okay, Bill, if you'll go ahead and do this.
Between the state of Florida and the defendant, Robert Tyrone Hayes, and render a true verdict according to the law and the evidence, so help you God.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have been selected and sworn as a jury to try the case of the state of Florida versus Robert Tyrone Hayes. This is a criminal case. Mr. Hayes is charged with 3 counts of first-degree premeditated murder relating to the deaths of Laquetta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton. The definition and elements of the crime of first-degree premeditated murder will be explained to you later. It is your solemn responsibility to determine if the state has proved its accusations beyond a reasonable doubt against Mr. Hayes. Your verdict must be based solely on the evidence or the lack of evidence and the law. The indictment, which I read to you earlier this week, is not evidence and is not to be considered by you as any proof of guilt. It is the judge's responsibility to decide which laws apply to this case and to explain those laws to you. It is your responsibility to decide what the facts of this case may be and then to apply the law to those facts. Thus, the province of the jury and the province of the court are well defined and they do not overlap. This is one of the fundamental principles of our system of justice. Before proceeding further, it will be helpful for you to understand how a trial is conducted. At the beginning of the trial, the lawyers will have an opportunity, if they wish, to make what is called an opening statement. The opening statement gives the lawyers a chance to tell you what evidence they believe will be presented during the trial. Now, what the lawyers say is not evidence, and you are not to consider it as such. Following the opening statements, Witnesses will be called to testify under oath. They will be examined and cross-examined by the lawyers. Documents and other exhibits also may be produced as evidence. After the evidence has been presented, the attorneys will have an opportunity to make what is called a final argument. Following the argument by the lawyers, the court will then instruct you on the law which is applicable to this case. After the instructions are given, you will retire to consider your verdict. Now, you should not form any definite or fixed opinion on the merits of the case until you have heard all of the evidence, the arguments of the lawyers, and the instructions on the law by the court. Until that time, you should not discuss this case among yourselves. And I want to repeat that. Do not discuss the case among yourselves. Now, during the course of the trial, the court will take breaks called recess, during which you will be permitted to separate and go about your personal affairs. During these breaks, you will not discuss the case with anyone, nor permit anyone to say anything to you or in your presence about the case. If anyone attempts to say anything to you or in your presence about this case, tell them that you are on the jury trying the case and ask them to stop. If they persist, leave them at once and immediately report the matter to the bailiff, who will then inform you. This case must be tried by you only on the evidence presented during the trial and in your presence and in the presence of the defendant, the lawyers, and the court. Jurors must not conduct any investigation of their own. Accordingly, you must not visit any of the places described in the evidence, and you must not read nor listen to any reports about this case. Further, you must not discuss this case with any person, and you must not speak with the lawyers, the witnesses, or the defendant about any subject matter until your deliberations are finished. In every criminal proceeding, a defendant has the absolute right to remain silent. At no time is it the duty of the defendant to prove his innocence. From the exercise of the defendant's right to remain silent, a jury is not permitted to draw any inference of guilt, and the fact that the defendant did or did not take the witness stand must not influence your verdict in any manner whatsoever. The lawyers are trained in the rules of evidence and trial procedure, and it is their duty to make all objections they feel are proper. When an objection is made, you should not speculate on the reason why it was made. Likewise, when an objection is sustained or upheld by me, you must not speculate on what might have occurred had the objection not been sustained, nor what the witness might have said had the witness been permitted to answer the question. Now, if you would like to take notes during the trial, you may do so. On the other hand, of course, you are not required to take notes if you don't want to. That is left up to you individually. You have been provided with a notepad and a pen for you to use if you wish to take notes. Any notes that you take will be for your own personal use. However, you should not take the notes with you from within the courtroom. During the breaks, the bailiff will ask you to take your notes and place them face down in your chair. When we reconvene, you will find your notes waiting for you in your chair. After you have completed your deliberations, the bailiff will deliver your notes to me. They will be destroyed. No one will ever get to read your notes. Now, if you do take notes, do not get so involved in note-taking that you become distracted from the proceedings. Your notes should be used only as an aid to your memory. Whether or not you take notes, you should rely on your own memory of the evidence, and you should not be unduly influenced by the notes of another juror. Notes are not entitled to any greater weight of the evidence than each juror's memory of the evidence. Now, this is the guilt phase of the trial. A possible sentence in this case shall have no bearing in your discussions or deliberations later on until you're allowed to do that, okay? I do want to say one more thing before we begin. Like I said before, we have a court reporter. She's going to take down every word that is spoken in this courtroom. During deliberations, you do have the right to ask for what's called a readback. If there's a question as to what a witness might have said, you know, the court reporter can come in here and then read the entire witness's testimony back to you. She can't segment it. She would have to read the entire witness's testimony. That's your right to ask for that. But that's a very tedious and cumbersome process and time-consuming. It is far more efficient if you just pay close attention as a witness is testifying live and accept the answers from them, as opposed to asking the court reporter to read it back from a cold record. Now, if at any time you have a witness that's soft-spoken, you can't hear, or you think you heard the answer wrong, please don't be bashful. Raise your hand and say, Judge, can you have the witness repeat the answer, please? And I'll gladly do that for you right there on the spot, okay? Thank you. State, you may give your opening statement.
Can I have the podium, Your Honor?
Yeah, yes. Okay, hold on. Someone need water? Yeah, we'll go ahead and get some. Hold on a second.
Here comes the girls. Thank you. Sorry.
All right, State, you may proceed.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Over the next 5 or 6 days, Mr. Lewis and I, on behalf of the state of Florida, will present to you over a dozen witnesses, multiple pieces of evidence, many of them from all the way back in 2005 and 2006, and some as recent as 2018 and 2019. And this evidence will show, and will prove beyond a reasonable doubt, that back in 2005 and 2006, the defendant in this case, Robert Hayes, killed not one, not two, but 3 women here in Volusia County, specifically in the city of Daytona Beach. The first of those murders occurred in December. Between December 24th and December 26th of 2005, Mr. Hayes killed his first victim, Laquetta Gunther. Within 3 weeks, he killed his second victim, who was found on January 14th of 2006, Julie Green. And a little over a month later, he killed his third victim, Iwana Patton, who was found on February 24th of 2006. 3 women, 3 months, and evidence will show they were all killed by the same person, and that person is in the courtroom today. But something had to occur before Mr. Hayes started to take the lives of these women. And I'm going to go through some key pieces of evidence that we'll show you during trial. I'm going to lay them out for you chronologically, and that's our intent at trial as well, to take it one murder at a time and show you chronologically as the events occurred and the investigation followed. An investigation that obviously took 14 or 15 years to conclude. So as the judge has already told you, there are 3 counts of premeditated first-degree murder in this case. As I said, this case really begins a couple weeks before the first murder. And it begins when Mr. Hayes purchases a firearm. And he purchases a firearm here at a local firearm dealer, Urbanak, which is right over the train tracks here on International Speedway Boulevard. There, Mr. Hayes goes on November 17th of 2005, where he purchases, well, first fills out the paperwork to purchase a firearm. He has to fill.
Hold on. I don't know.
Is it starting? Now, can they see us? Yeah, it's in.
I don't know how to
Moving.
person. Hold on.
And then again.
You have to remove her. You know how to do that? Hold on, I gotta do something else. Fine.
Thank you, Judge. Technology makes everything easier, but usually more complicated in the long run. And I feel like it won't be our only time we stop this week to deal with a few things. But anyway, as I was saying, Mr. Hayes, on November 17th of 05, goes to Buck's Gun Range, and he fills out the application he needs to fill out to purchase a firearm. He returns on December 2nd of 05 and actually takes possession of a firearm from Buck's Gun Range. Specifically, he buys two things and walks out the door with them that day. A Smith & Wesson 40 caliber VE semi-automatic handgun. He also walks out with one box of 40 caliber American Eagle ammunition. There's a receipt for the purchase. On all the paperwork is his date of birth, his address, his signature, all identifying information for Mr. Hayes back in December of 2005. 3 weeks later, this is the location where Laquetta Gunther is found. Between these two buildings, there's a very narrow alleyway where she is located on December 26th of 2005. This is just across from 505 North Beach Street here at Daytona Beach. As I said, located in the alleyway. There are some very unique things about how this gun was found. She was nude except for white socks. She had no identification, no Florida ID, no credit cards, nothing to say who this person was. She was on all fours, face down, almost wedged between this narrow alleyway. She had a gunshot wound to the back of her head, a single gunshot wound. Despite not having any identification, she was later identified through her fingerprints as Laquetta Gunther, age 45. She was known to perhaps engage in prostitution in the Daytona Beach area. Evidence is collected, and that includes a sexual assault kit. What a sexual assault kit is, and you're going to see sexual assault kits come up over and over in this case, is basically something the medical examiner collects at the autopsy. They will do swabs from the oral cavity, the anal cavity, the vaginal cavity. They might collect pubic hair, things of that nature, and it's packaged into what we commonly call a sexual assault kit, so that can go off to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for DNA analysis. They do locate some clothing underneath her. You'll see in photographs later that there is multiple items in this alleyway. It's a pretty dirty alleyway. But in there they do find some clothing underneath her body. Physical evidence collected at that first crime scene. They send off that sexual assault kit to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They analyze it for DNA, and this is way back in 2006 when these results come in. And they locate a male DNA profile from the swabs from the victim's mouth. And that DNA is also identified as semen. They also find some ballistic evidence at this first crime scene. Now, how a gun works, many of you may commonly know, especially a semi-automatic firearm, is that when the gun discharges and the pin ejects the projectile comes through the barrel of the firearm. You're going to hear this from an expert in ballistics. When that projectile goes through that barrel, and when I say projectile, I just mean the bullet, and it gets unique markings on the bullet, unique to the firearm. The shell casing on a semi-automatic firearm is discharged out the side of the gun, and it could go several different ways when it's discharged. But like the bullet, that shell casing gets unique markings that can be matched up to other shell casings fired from the same firearm. In this case, law enforcement locates the bullet, the projectile. It's in clothing found underneath the victim. And this bullet had very unique markings. Like I said, they can be unique to individual firearms. In this case, it had 5 lands and grooves on the bullet with a right twist. And at that time in 2005, there were only 2 types of firearms that left this unique marking on a bullet. And that those firearms that did it, one was a revolver, and one was a Smith & Wesson 40 caliber VE. The same firearm purchased by the defendant, the same type of firearm purchased by the defendant at Buck's Guns only 3 weeks before. That brings me to January of 2006. And this is the location where the second victim, Julie Green, was located. This area is out off of LPGA. It's commonly called the Bayberry Lakes Development. It's now a completed development here in Daytona Beach, and it's out where Margaritaville is and things of that nature. But back in '05, the development was still under construction. This is out in the back of the development. The access roadway that you see running along the top of the picture goes to LPGA, out to the north of the picture. And this is actually a road to a school now, this access road. But you can see the development and where the plots are for the houses. Julie Green is located approximately where this white truck is in the photograph. And with Miss Green, there were startling similarities between how she was found and how Miss Gunther was found. Like Miss Gunther, the evidence will show she was completely nude. She was face down. She had no identification, no photo ID, driver's license, credit cards, nothing to say who she was. She had a gunshot wound to the back of her head, single gunshot wound. Same way identification was made, through fingerprints. She also was known to occasionally engage in prostitution in the Daytona Beach area. And in this case, law enforcement, when they sent their crime scene unit out, they located more than just a bullet. This time they located a casing as well. So they found a bullet, and they found a .40 caliber casing, American Eagle ammunition. The same ammunition, same type of ammunition, purchased by the victim, Robert Hayes. Like Laquetta Gunther, a sexual assault kit was collected at her autopsy. In this case, again, the sexual assault kit was sent off. Testing was done by FDLE. A male DNA profile was recovered from the swabs. This DNA profile was not consistent with the DNA profile from the first victim. So you've got a DNA profile for Ms. Gunther, a different DNA profile for Ms. Green. But the ballistic evidence, specifically the bullet, had the same markings. That an expert is able to look at it and say this bullet was fired from either the revolver back then or the .40 caliber Smith & Wesson semi-automatic VE. But in this one, there's a cartridge case. And you'll hear from our expert that when there's a cartridge case that's actually ejected from the gun, that means it's a semi-automatic gun. It's not a revolver. A revolver keeps the shell casings inside of the gun. So from this evidence, law enforcement was able to tell this was a semi-automatic firearm. And again, as I said previously, the unique markings, the Smith & Wesson .40 caliber VE. And finally, Ms. Patton. Iwana Patton, the third victim, was located in the city of Daytona Beach. In this area, you probably don't recognize, this is actually now pretty much the entryway to the Daytona Beach Police Department. And Ms. Patton's body is located just up this access pathway here. As I said earlier, she was found on February 24th of 2006. Again, striking similarities to the other two victims who were found. She was found completely nude except for a pair of white socks, again positioned face down, again no identification. Gunshot wound this time to the front of her head. She was later identified by her fingerprints. She was known to occasionally engage in prostitution. You'll learn that she also worked at an ALS living facility as well. And law enforcement finds a shell casing. They find a .40 caliber, again, American Eagle ammunition shell casing. A sexual assault kit is collected like the other cases. The sexual assault kit is sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. You're going to hear from, I hate to say it, but you're going to be overwhelmed with DNA experts in this case. You're going to hear from 4 separate DNA experts. So I don't want to belabor telling you how the DNA testing is done, but they're going to explain to you how it works very thoroughly. On the swabs that are collected from her vaginal cavity, Florida Department of Law Enforcement locates male DNA, specifically semen. The ballistic evidence, I said, the shell casing. And then the crimes are linked. Law enforcement sees this pattern. They see it from the crime scenes alone, how the victims are left. But then as the evidence is analyzed, they see these striking similarities. And they see that not only are the crime scenes similar, how the victims are left is similar, how they die is similar, their lifestyle is similar, but also all the crimes are connected. And law enforcement believes they were committed, every one of these murders, by the same person. So these are the three connections you will see in the evidence in this case. And I've marked the murders, if you're hearing these names for the first time, as the first, second, and third murder. They have those 2 bullets from Gunther and Green that have those unique rifling characteristics that are consistent with being fired from a Smith & Wesson 40 caliber BB. They have shell casings from the crime scene on Ms. Green, the second murder, Ms. Patton, the third murder. And they have male DNA from Ms. Gunther's mouth and male DNA from Ms. Patton's vagina. As I said, same rifling markings, fired from the same type of gun. As to the shell casings, those are sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to a ballistics expert who looks at the markings on those shell casings. And you'll hear from that ballistics expert, and he's going to tell you that these shell casings were not only fired from a discharge from the same type of gun, but from the exact same firearm. These casings were discharged from the same firearm at the crime scene of the second murder and the third murder. And finally, the male DNA. You're going to hear from FDLE experts, DNA experts, who will tell you the profile, the male DNA found in the mouth of Laquetta Gunther was the same male DNA found on the vaginal swabs of the third victim, Ms. Patton. So once law enforcement has this information and they believe it's the same person, they create a task force. And this task force existed on and off for a couple of years, and it pooled a lot of resources. It pooled resources from, and I've got abbreviations up there, but the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, you've heard me reference them, the Daytona Beach Police Department, the Sheriff's Office assisted, even the FBI assisted in some capacity with this investigation to try to locate this person who they believe committed all 3 murders. And they focused on 2 big leads, and I just showed you the big connections there, but the 2 big leads were the DNA and the firearm. So they had the DNA, and they had those casings which matched up. And they knew what type of gun it was at this point in time. They knew it was the Smith & Wesson 40 caliber VE semi-automatic handgun. So what did they do with the leads? They went around the county and located as many people as they could that purchased that type of firearm. So they went to Buck's Guns. And they got Buck's Guns records, for example, and found out every single person that had recently bought a Smith & Wesson 40 caliber VE. And I'm going to touch on it again in a few minutes, but one of those people on that list, of course, was the defendant, Robert Hayes. He purchased that gun on December 2nd of 2005. In regards to the DNA, you'll hear from members of this task force. They swabbed hundreds of people. This task force was set up to receive leads. They had like a leads call, almost like a 911 number you could call if you had a tip on this case. And what they did is when they get a call, they followed up every single lead that they received. So over the course of the next 10, 15 years, they swabbed and submitted hundreds of swabs for comparison to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. When I say swabs, I mean, we're talking about jury selection with the 23andMe. You swab the inside of somebody's mouth, you put it in a container, you send it to the lab, and the lab can take the DNA profile from that swab and compare it to the DNA profile they had from the victims in this case. But despite the efforts of this task force, they did not develop any viable suspects that leads to any type of arrest in 2006, 2007, and so on. And the case effectively goes cold. 2007 to 2016, there's still some leads. The case is assigned to a senior detective, and he continues to follow up on leads as they come in. They continue to submit swabs. So they're still working the case, but nothing significant happens for 9 years. And then in 2016, something very significant happens which leads to this case ultimately being solved by law enforcement. There's a fourth murder, a fourth victim. This fourth victim was not in Volusia County. This fourth victim was in Palm Beach County. Her name is Rachel Bay, and she was located on March 7th in 2016 in a rural area in Palm Beach County. It's just off of I'm going to have a map up in a second, but they were basically developing a highway, widening it out. So you had the two main lanes, and on the sides you had the graded area. A lot of dirt, a lot of gravel. She's found off to the side of the graded area. And you're going to see in this trial the same similarities as the three cases here at Daytona Beach. Completely nude, face down, no identification. In this case, you'll actually see that there are drag marks where Miss Bay was dragged across the gravel roadway and left on the side of the road. She is identified as Rachel Bay through fingerprints. She also known to engage in prostitution in the Palm Beach area. Now they do multiple swabs in this case, so because of the way she's positioned, as if she's been dragged across the dirt roadway, they swab her hands. They swab the inside and the outside of her hands. And that's done by the sheriff's office down there. And they collect the sexual assault kit. And here's a map of the area, generally in Palm Beach, which you'll see at trial. So you've got West Palm Beach down here, and up this rural highway, which is commonly referred to as the Beeline Highway, Rachel Bay is located on the side of the roadway up there. You're going to see this same process in this case as you saw in the Daytona cases. It leads to, obviously, an investigation by law enforcement. They're called out in the early morning when Rachel is found on the side of the road. Forensics goes out there, they do those swabs, they process the crime scene, and ultimately, their materials, so those swabs are sent to the Palm Beach County Forensic Biology Unit. Their sheriff's office has their own forensic unit. Here in Daytona, we use the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Laboratory. They use the Palm Beach County laboratory. They're lucky enough to have their own lab. So male DNA is located on two spots on Rachel Bay's body. It's located on the swab of the top of the left hand. Remember I said that they felt it was important to swab those hands because of the drag marks. Male DNA was also located on vaginal swabs that were collected from Miss Bay. And this was the lead that restarted the investigation. You're going to hear from Detective David Denardi about how he was assigned this cold case, and then this happened a short time after, and it really reopened the investigation fully. Because what happens with DNA is if the DNA that is recovered by law enforcement is good enough, it's got enough markers, it's a strong enough sample, they can put it into a system that's called the Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS, so here's called CODIS throughout trial. And what CODIS allows is it allows for cases to basically hit off each other. So if an unknown person commits a crime, they leave their DNA there, it goes into CODIS. If they commit another crime, and they leave their DNA there, and that DNA is good enough to go into CODIS, CODIS will tell the agencies there's a match here. The same person's DNA is associated with both of these cases. And that's exactly what happened in this case. So Palm Beach County gets told, hey, the same DNA was found in these murder cases up at Daytona Beach. And Daytona Beach gets a notice saying, hey, same DNA was found in Palm Beach County. And they're notified in December of 2016, as I said, kind of kicked things up a notch for these agencies, because they also started working together. And you'll hear that while they were working together, a very big murder case out in California was solved, and it was all over the news. It was on, they were doing Netflix documentaries about it. It was the Green River Killer or something like that. And that case was solved using something that's called genetic genealogy. And we talked about the 23andMe and jury selection. So law enforcement decided to attempt to use genetic genealogy to try to locate a family member of the DNA source. And it's a long process. It involves testing of the materials, it involves searching and researching through these databases that law enforcement had access to. Again, we talked about that during jury selection, the legal access to these databases. And this investigation leads to a woman who was directly related to the source of that DNA. The research showed that the source of the foreign DNA was a half-brother of this woman. Law enforcement investigated her, found out she had 3 half-brothers. One of them is in the courtroom with you now, Robert Hayes. With this information, law enforcement looks at where Mr. Hayes is, and he's in Palm Beach County. He's living in the same county where Rachel Bay was killed in 2016. And they do a little background on Mr. Hayes. They look into his life, where he's lived, what he's done. These are some of the important things that they find out. They find out that he was attending the university right down the road here from 2000 to 2006, when all 3 murders occurred in 2005 and 2006. He was living here in Volusia County. He majored in criminal justice at the Cookman. He lived at 427 Jefferson in Daytona. You'll see that's the same address on the gun paperwork that I was talking about earlier. He purchased that Smith & Wesson .40 caliber BE and the American Eagle ammo. And as I said earlier, law enforcement did speak with him when they were going through all those lists in 2006. In March of 2006, members of the task force, going down the list of who bought this gun, they go out and they talk to Mr. Hayes at 427 Jefferson. And remember what law enforcement was doing, because I told you the evidence will show law enforcement would go to people and ask them to voluntarily, hey, can we borrow your gun? Can we take it to the gun range, shoot off a couple rounds, and take the casings with us? That's what they were doing to follow up on that lead, but it was all voluntary. When Mr. Hayes told law enforcement in 2006, he didn't have his gun anymore. He said he gifted it to his mother. And this is in March of 2006. He says he gifted the Smith & Wesson .40 caliber BE to his mom. But you'll hear evidence that that same year, 9 months later, in December of 2006, Mr. Hayes reported that Smith & Wesson .40 caliber BE stolen in Riviera Beach. Not gifted to his mother, but stolen. As I said, he was living in West Palm Beach when Rachel Bay was killed. So at this point, law enforcement's got the background on the brothers. Mr. Hayes, one of the 3. And they decided we need to determine whether or not the source of the DNA was from one of these 3. So law enforcement basically surveils Mr. Hayes, and he's seen at a bus stop. You can hear from the officers from Palm Beach who are sitting there watching him and who collected this evidence. And he discards a couple pieces of trash at the bus stop. And law enforcement has their eyes on these 2 items the whole time. Sees him throw down the cigarette butt. Sees him throw away, drink from the beer can and throw it away. So they get these items, they seal them up, package them, take them to the lab. And they're tested. They're swabbed just like you'd swab the inside of somebody's mouth to get DNA. And they also collected items from Mr. Hayes' brothers. Those items were tested as well, and they are excluded. So the 2 other brothers are excluded as the source of the DNA in the Daytona Beach cases and the Palm Beach case. The first thing they do with this cigarette butt and this beer can, they make sure it's got the same DNA on it. So they're able to get a profile from the cigarette butt, and they're able to get a profile from the beer can. They compare those, it's the same person, which law enforcement knows because they saw Mr. Hayes using both items. They then take that DNA from the beer can, from the cigarette, and that DNA matches the DNA found on Laquetta Gunther's oral swabs, the semen that was inside of her mouth when they found her on December 26th of 2005. The law enforcement wants to make sure, so they actually get a search warrant. They go to Mr. Hayes with the search warrant, and they do the whole 23andMe swabbing of the mouth, and send that DNA off for comparison as well. And sure enough, Hayes' DNA matched the male DNA from Gunther, as they already knew. Hayes' DNA matched the DNA recovered from Iwana Patton's vagina. And Hayes' DNA matched the DNA recovered from Rachel Bay's vaginal swabs and from the top of her left hand. Mr. Hayes is interviewed by law enforcement. You're going to see this interview. It's a pretty short interview, but some important things are said during it that I'd like you to know now going into this case. And the evidence will show these things. He denies ever knowing Rachel Bay. He has shown multiple photographs of Rachel Bay, denies ever knowing that woman, seeing that woman, having sex with that woman, denies it repeatedly during the interview. He admits to frequently using Backpage.com, which you'll learn is a website that allows escorts to post ads on there. You'll learn that Rachel Bay actually had an escort ad on Backpage.com, but Mr. Hayes admits to using that. But he also says that, and he admits to using prostitutes multiple times, he says he always uses a condom. Always uses a condom. He never doesn't use a condom with prostitutes. He provides an inaccurate phone number for 2016. So he gives law enforcement his number during the interview, and I'm going to come back to it in a second. Law enforcement does their own research and finds out he had a different number in 2016 when Rachel Bay was killed. He admits to living in Daytona Beach at the time of the murders here. And then a couple other items that are important to know ahead of time that were in Palm Beach, and one of them is the phone. The other one is that the defendant's mother is interviewed. Daytona Beach, Palm Beach County, they go and they talk to Mr. Hayes' mother, Florence Hayes, and ask her, did your son give you a gun in 2005 or 2006? Did he ever give you a gun in your entire life? She says, no. My son never gave me a firearm as a kid. And then the cell phone. You see there, the number ends in 6912. And you're going to hear from an officer, a detective, who's really well versed in cell phones, and this is one of the reasons we talk about it, jury selection, and how they work when you get those records. Because you can actually take those records from the cell phone company and put them into a program that allows you to map out where the phone is moving. And on these records, ending in 6912, it shows the phone moving from the area where Robert Hayes was living, up the Beeline Highway to where Rachel Bay was found, and returning to the area where he was living. The phone goes up there in the early hours of March 7th of 2016, which is 3, 4, 5 hours before Rachel Bay is found naked and dead on the side of the highway. And the phone number is associated with Mr. Hayes, because what you get with these phone records is you also get the subscriber information. So you get who that phone is assigned to. So if any of us wanted our phone records and we got the records, it would say it's assigned to me, Andrew Urbanak, it's my phone. Those records say that in 2016, at the time that Rachel Bay was murdered, that cell phone with the number ending in 6912 belonged to the defendant, Robert Hayes. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, after you hear the testimony and evidence in this case, you're going to hear from people ranging from lay witnesses like somebody on the street who didn't want to be involved with this, going to the bathroom behind a building and finding a body. You're going to hear from multiple DNA experts. You're going to hear from law enforcement from 05, law enforcement from now, officers from multiple counties, ballistics experts. You're going to get the chance to look and see the evidence yourself over the next 5 or 6 days. And in closing, Mr. Lewis and I will come back up to the podium and ask you to return the only verdict that the law and the evidence supports in this case, which is that Mr. Robert Hayes is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of killing, not once, not twice, but 3 times here in Volusia County in 2005 and 2006. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Shea, you wish to give an opening statement?
I do, Your Honor. Thank you.
You may proceed.